The ministry of Jesus did not end in his intercession on the cross. The ministry of Jesus will not end in his intercession in heaven. The ministry of Jesus will actually climax in his intercession on the day of the Lord. So Jesus' gospel mission will not fade away in silence, but it will actually peak in what we call a final call to worship. And that final call to worship is located in the run-up to his coming in glory. Now, Jesus made it very, very clear in his conversation with disciples that his gospel ministry will climax in a triumph, not in a defeat. Despite any appearance to the contrary, it will end in success. So when the disciples asked him, "When will this be?" Jesus actually gave them a very surprising answer. He said, "They will hand you over to be tortured." That's not pleasant at all. "And you will be hated by all nations because of my name." And who wants that? So the followers of Jesus, they actually look like a band of losers when you listen to what Jesus is saying. If they expected a smooth journey from now on into the kingdom come, you can forget it. The world at large is not going to receive what they have to tell with any greater enthusiasm than they received Jesus himself. So the future actually looks gloomy according to what Jesus is saying. And Jesus deepens this. He doesn't weaken it, he strengthens it. He says, "Then many will fall away, and many false prophets will rise and lead many astray, and the love of many will grow cold." We know this is a human law of existence, that under pressure and persecution and opposition, most people will lose their initial enthusiasm if something has caught their enthusiasm. And they will either run away or they will look for an easier alternative. So in such days, according to Jesus, the false prophets will have a field day. They can exploit it. So, the future not only looks gloomy according to Jesus, it looks as a mission impossible, ending in defeat on all imaginable fronts. And yet, Jesus will end this discussion with assurance that the mission will succeed. At the end, he says it this way, "But anyone who endures to the end will be saved." And the good news of the kingdom will be preached throughout the world as a testimony to all nations, and then the end will come. That's a general picture given by Jesus. This is assurance. Struggles, he says, yes. Difficulties, yes. Setbacks in the mission, yes. But success in the end, yes. This is what he's saying. It will end big, he says. It will end globally. It will end in triumph. And that is the point when you follow that discourse up to this point. Yet dark and turbulent times are ahead of them. Jesus actually looks into the future through the prophetic lens of Daniel, as we shall see. He said the following. That's the next he's saying. "So when you see the desolating sacrilege standing on holy place, as spoken by the prophet Daniel, let the reader understand." Then those, and then he continues. It's simply mandatory for Jesus to emphasize that we should read and understand what the prophet Daniel is talking about, because that's the lens through which Jesus is projecting the future of the story. Now, as we usually say, when you engage in warfare, you should know your enemy. And here, the secret intelligence service of the universe is actually giving insight into the enemy war plans. This is what Jesus had in mind when he referred through the prophet Daniel. If you want to know the future, if you want to know the war plans of the enemy, which he calls a desolating sacrilege, this is where you should look. This is the Cosmic Intelligence Service that's already given you insight into what the opposition is up to. And here you read about how the enemy plans to attack and subvert and destroy true worship. This is the main point. Actually, this is a warfare that will continue to the end of the age, according to Jesus. And Jesus again quotes Daniel. He keeps looking through that lens when he said the following. We read, "For at that time there will be a great suffering. Such has never been seen from the beginning of the world until now, no, and never will be." Now Jesus will place his own glorious return in power as the very climax of that era of suffering. And we will learn more about that when we look deeper into how Jesus is actually using the prophetic lens of Daniel. For the time being, it's enough just to say that Jesus saw the climax of God's final call to worship through that lens. In short, this old conflict over worship will continue in the imperial attack upon the Jerusalem worship, which is the very grip of the gospel. And it will actually intensify in the subsequent imperial attack upon the apostolic gospel. This is what he's saying. A conflict that, according to Jesus, will climax in the run-up to his return in glory. So, these scenes that Jesus is drawing up sets, should I say, the context for the future drama of the church and the era of the church and the mission of the church in this world. And this is the story to which we shall now turn. Now, the apostolic times are long gone. It's a long time ago. And we are no more in the trials and difficulties of medieval times. It's all gone. Nor are we even in the Reformation struggles regarding salvation. Global world with a global challenge and global opportunities for outreach. A world in which the grand story is now being told globally. And it's a time in which Christ, if he wanted to, could move and complete his mission, in bringing the mission to its climax and its end, as he has promised he will do. And that's exactly what John the Revelator was seeing in a grand vision about the end of time. John the Revelator is often understood to be John the Gospel writer, but he has a vision. And this is the vision in which we read the following. "Then I saw another angel flying in mid-heaven with an eternal gospel to proclaim to those who live on earth, to every nation and tribe and language and people." Now, this here, the proclamation is actually reaching what we would call a global level, with a global intensity. And it seems to be happening as a single collective event, in which, should I say, the proclamation is swelling into an absolute climax as we read. He continues. "He said," that's the angelic messenger, megaphone, that's the Greek word for, should I say, loud. We have it in the word a megaphone. "He said in a loud voice, fear God and give him glory, for the hour of his judgment has come." So this proclamation will peak at the time called the hour of judgment, when Christ will return in glory at the end of the age. So the timing of what he is seeing, the place and the period in which this is happening is clearly the end time idea. Now, this angelic messenger is not flying alone, You actually see three angelic messengers on a row, just like a formation, flying in formation. It's just like three white swans flying in a great formation, each with their specific appeal to the inhabitants of the world. This is what it is. The one leading, the first one, the formation, has a massive call to worship, a gospel call. The second one following basically has a liberation message that is saying the era of Babylonian exile is over. And the third one is basically giving a sharp warning against an alternative worship, as we read. Then another angel, a third, followed them, crying out with a loud, again, megaphone, those who worship the image and its beast and its image. And then follows what in the Bible, in my view, is the most chilling warning that you could ever read anywhere in Scripture. Whenever I read it, I have the chills down my back. It's a warning against an alternative worship, or what is called the beast and its image. All through the biblical history, there has been a deep conflict between, on the one side, the true worship of the Creator God and alternatives. This is nothing new. But what we are encountering in the vision of John the Revelator is that there's never been anything like this. For anyone who is familiar with the Israelite religious culture, they would immediately have understood what the angelic messengers are saying when they warn against a beast-wielding power over humanity. Since the days of the prophet Daniel, and we are back to Daniel again, which Jesus appeals to, beasts of various descriptions has been used as the preferred designation for what we today would call a human imperial power that will emerge on the scene of action down through history and seek to enforce its own world order, beginning with the Babylonian Empire enforcing worship of the golden image. This is a classic. So beast in the Israelite thinking is very clearly a symbol of what we today call empires of evil. We have even heard presidents talk like that. Empire of evil. And just see the list in the book of Daniel chapter 7 and you will know. And John in the text in Revelation chapters 13 to 14 is zooming in on this end time manifestations of the long string of imperial moves in this world, attempting to make one world, speaking with one voice, having one worship. About this end time imperial attempt to enforce a world order, we read the following. In amazement, the whole world will follow the beast, and they will worship the beast, saying, "Who is the beast and who can fight against it?" In other words, he's talking about something that is global. He is describing it as absolutely unstoppable. No human force seemed to be able to battle against it. Even if they wanted to, they have to give up. It's global. Its impact is global, as we read. The beast was given authority over tribe, people, and language, and all the inhabitants of the world worshipped it. In other words, it is big. This is global. It is something that has popular support. It's something that will take the world with storm. And according to John the Revelator, there is a deeper reason given why something like that could ever happen. He zooms in on the emergence of another power in the world that will be able to wield this kind of worship. And that this power apparently will have what looks like a Christian face. There is something puzzling in what happens and what he writes. He says it this way: Then I saw another beast that rose out of the earth. It had 2 horns like a lamb, and it spoke like a dragon. In other words, it is what we today would call a sheep, in a wolf in sheep's clothing. It's not really what it appears to be. Now, the symbol lamb is a symbol that is used in the book of Revelation 29 times as the code word for none other than Jesus Christ. Just read through the book and notice how that unifies the entire story. The lamb symbol is the symbol par excellence used by Job, used by John to designate Jesus Christ. Except this once. And here it is used to describe a power that will lead the world to worship anything else but the Lamb. But as actually it pretends to be a servant of the Lamb. This is puzzling. This is a great deception. And we read, as John says it, it performs great signs, even making fire come down from heaven to earth in the sight of all. And by the sign it deceives the inhabitants of the earth. So for John, this is the big deceiver, pretending to be a servant of Jesus Christ. Exactly what the imperial form this force will take, it is nevertheless seen as the one who will lead the world in an attempt to persuade and enforce compliance to a particular worship. And they will do it by means of a very powerful sign. And I think we should notice this. Those who are familiar with the larger biblical story will remember that this is the Elijah sign. Fire from heaven. That's the Elijah sign. That's the old episode at Mount Carmel when the prophet Elijah charged the Israelites to choose who to worship. He said, if Baal is God, worship him. And if the Lord is God, then worship him. And he made a deal with the people and said, the God who answers with fire from heaven, he is the true God. This is what is being emulated here. So God's calling card in the days of Elijah was fire from heaven on earth. But this time, and that's what we should notice, John the Revelator will tell us the fire will fall on the wrong worship. This is a deception. The sign will be so overwhelming that the world will follow this kind of worship. Now, visible signs is something that our scientifically minded world has long been asking for. They have demanded it for a long time. God must give evidence for his existence, physical evidence, if we are going to believe him. And here they get more than they have bargained for. And they'll worship it unless they know better. This is the point that John the Revelator is making. So in this crisis over worship, which is indeed, from the point of view of God, a deep, deep crisis, what is he going to do? He's not going to perform a big supernatural sign as in the days of Elijah. The enemy will have hijacked this kind of argument. Instead, he will send them a message, loud and clear, as we read. He said in a loud, again, megaphone voice, fear God and give glory to him and worship him who made the heavens and earth, the sea and the springs of water. Again, I'll have to say those familiar with the larger biblical narrative that we have been reading so far will immediately notice that the call will take you right back to the beginning story of the Bible, where we for the first time hear anything about a God who created everything, who ordered everything, who animated everything living. It's the beginning story of the biblical narrative. So the really startling feature in this sentence is actually the following: made the heavens and the earth and the sea. Now, those again familiar with the biblical story so far will notice that this is a phrase that is taken straight out of the fourth of the first four of the 10 commandments. Who are these commandments all about? Who to worship, how to worship, when to worship, and why worship. This is what they're about. This is not a call for any pan or universal worship. It's a worship of the God of the biblical beginning story. It's very particular. It's the God of the Israelites. It's the God of Jesus Christ. It's the God of the apostles. This is the God of the eternal gospel that is being called on to worship here. So, the end time will see a global conflict over who to worship. It's no longer a conflict over worship contra no worship, or religion versus no religion, or faith versus no faith. Now, secularism and atheism may have had its day, but at that time which John the Revelator is talking about, they are spent forces. They can do nothing. They will fall into the category, maybe, of those who would like to fight against the beast and its worship, but cannot. We have already read about that. Some people will resign and say, who can fight against it? They may fall into that. In the book of Revelation, John the Revelator is drawing a big line in the sand between the worship of what is called the beast and the worship of the Creator. And at that time, according to John the Revelator, everybody will have to make up their minds. In the end, on that day, there will be no third option. That's the bottom line of what he's saying. Now, even the literary and the thematic thematic structure of the book of Revelation highlights that this is the climax of an age-old conflict over worship. It didn't start here. This is where it ends, according to John. And the heavenly call to worship the Creator is the very sender of the book of the Apocalypse. This is it. What else could be more important when you read in the Bible than who to worship? This is the key theme of the entire book. Now, the book itself, it is formed like a giant pyramid, what scholars would call a chiasm. We shall say no more about that, except that on the one side you have a leg in which there is a series of visions that progressively leads up to this conflict at the end of the age. All of these visions, they all climax in this giant conflict at the end. And it's followed by another leg on the other side of the book, where you have a series of visions that progressively outlines the outcome of this conflict. And the two sides of the pyramid will complement and they'll reinforce each other. And they will point powerfully to the very center of the book, the end time call to worship. This is the center of the book. This is not a call to any kind of worship. The key sentence in the final call to worship, as I have already said, is taken directly from the worship commandments in the 10 Commandments. It's taken from the fourth of the first 4 of the 10 Commandments, which are all about worship. And here we read, and now we quote from the 10 Commandments, the fourth one. For in 6 days the Lord made heaven and earth, the sea, and all that's in them. Notice the sentence. It's being repeated, quoted by John. But rested on the 7th day, therefore the Lord blessed the Sabbath day and consecrated it. Now, this is a commandment that will take us right back to the beginning story, where we hear about worship language for the first time. We haven't heard it before. Consecrated time, holy time as it is called. Now, that is time when God is given, where God is given the primary attention. That's what is meaning of holy and consecrated time. God is the object of attention. That's another way of talking about worship. This is when God receives your attention. You are worshiping Him. Now, right after God gave this commandment, He gave another, deepening footnote to the 10 Commandments. He added a booknote regarding the meaning of this worship. He's saying the following about the Sabbath. Given in order that you may know that I, the Lord, sanctifies you. The term sanctify is a biblical language for what we could call the language of human spiritual formation. For this is what's about it. The point is that the Sabbath here is seen as instrumental for that purpose. Not that the time itself has that effect, but the object of attention during that time has that effect on the worshipper. That's the point, namely communication with God, which is simply the biblical recipe for what we could call spiritual formation. And that formation takes time, plenty of time, regular time, if you please. We notice when we read the biblical story, we again go back to the beginning, that persons like Enoch, Noah, Moses, Abraham, and all the names in the big Hall of Fame list that you find in the Epistle to Hebrews, they all are characterized as people who walked with God. That is, they spent time with God. And that is the secret recipe of their spiritual formation. So they became the persons they became. Jesus never gave people a to-do list when he talked to them about what life was all about. But he simply said, follow me. That's another way of saying, spend time with me. That's the essence of worship. So some people would ask, why the Sabbath worship from the very beginning of the story, in the beginning story? In our individualistic, self-improvement culture, with its focus on personal self-improvement, we often miss the real purpose of the Sabbath and its worship. Now, it's about more than person building worship. It is about community building worship. See, the kingdoms of this world, to build a community, they rely on external control, law enforcement and power to force an order upon the world. But that's not how God wants to build a community. That is not the way He's going to do it. He wants to build a community with very different means. And He wants to build a community based on internally shared values. And the value that is central here is love. And And the recipe for building and upholding such a community is actually community building worship. This is God's method of creating community. And that requires time. And God set off time from the very beginning for that purpose. For when we as a group are in orbit around God and His values of love, we develop personal trusts, social trusts, confidence and loyalties as we share, and as we cherish the values of the God that we worship. So worship is about much more than person building, important as that may be. It's about community building. So God set time off from the very beginning, at the very start, as the very secret of developing the kind of community that we call paradise living. So we should not be surprised that God at the end of this great drama will make a final call and appeal directly to the community building purpose of Sabbath worship. A worship that is almost forgotten in our world today. Now, more about this community building worship in the supplementary study attached to this presentation. So before we take a deeper look at Christ's restoring ministry, we will first zoom in on Christ's returning glory, and we call that a triumphant ministry.